The therapist may say almost nothing, may be involved in no activity in terms of movement, may not even interpret material for a long time, may make no comments unless it's absolutely necessary, simply becomes the participating observer. Just as we have in normal ego function, an observing ego and a participating ego, you can think of the kind of sensory hypnoanalysis that I've been trying to describe as the modular equivalent of a participating and observing ego. At first, the patient is an observing ego and it's observing what's being intervened. Then becomes the participating ego, and the therapist becomes the observer. But let me, in a more systematic way, just describe some of this. New ideas in science are generally induced by new discoveries. At the present time, it seems that the most potent factor in promoting new discoveries has been the introduction not of brand new ideas, because I don't think in the history of psychotherapy we really have uncovered in recent years any great new ideas. We have uncovered new techniques, new strategies, new tactics. But if you read, and many of you have, the older literature of psychotherapy, there are no great new discoveries really since Freud's awareness and recognition of the unconscious, but only new techniques, modifications of techniques. But those techniques constitute discoveries. Scientists have been at it so long that most natural phenomena and all events, particularly those of the inanimate world, have been pretty well scrutinized. And therefore we run into the problem that most young therapists have already a well-stocked pantry full of ideas and facts, and they're not really ready for some new ones. Hypnosis offers a possibility of being much more inventive and much more creative, and that based on individual means of intervening, one can do things on one's own. One can do things differently as the case indicates.
Scusate se interrompo, vorrei presentare la nostra teoria sulle ipnosuggestioni che si differenziano molto dalle suggestioni. No.
Sì, sì.
Si sente?
Sì, sì.
Funziona o no?
Sì, funziona. Sì, funziona.
Già nella mia edizione del 1977 del volume Ipnoterapia e psicosomatica, io ho presentato una nuova teoria che realmente non è affatto nuova, perché esiste da che esiste il genere umano, ma che è passata inavvertita attraverso i millenni. Che sia passata inavvertita attraverso i millenni me lo dà come prova l'accaduto al congresso del dicembre 1978 tenuto in mio onore all'ospedale
Di Venere di Bari,
tra medici, psicologi, psichiatri e dirigenti. Serbo un grato ricordo di quell'onore, ma maggiore importanza ha non il ricordo, ma la dottrina che allora ho esposto e che è sembrata nuova ai pur ben colti in materia dei miei ascoltatori. L'energia vita, il nostro io anzi, è una carica di energia vita. Questo è universalmente accolto da tutte le leggi del pianeta. L'io dà per vivo il soggetto. la carica di vita è quindi l'io. Tutti i codici del pianeta considerano portatori di diritto solo il vivo, quindi solo chi ha una carica di vita che noi sentiamo condensata in quello che diciamo ogni momento io, che è l'affermazione della personalità. L'energia vita è quel nuovo, l'antichissimo, il geologico, ha due azioni, vitalizzante e attivante. Noi la viviamo questa duplice azione ogni giorno, fin da millenni. Di notte è sospesa la attivante ed è in azione la vitalizzante. Quando siamo in anestesia si ha la stessa situazione. In coma idem. Abbiamo due azioni dell'energia vita. La vitalizzante per cui esiste il nostro io, ma non è attivo, e la attivante che fa sì che il nostro io sia attivo e, come lo sappiamo benissimo, attivo per intellettualità, cioè capacità di ricevere la rappresentazione particolareggiata della realtà, emotività per la elaborazione di quanto apprendiamo dalla cognizione della realtà e volontà con la quale noi esprimiamo il nostro volere in ordine alla volontà quale ci si presenta per ridurla a migliori rapporti con noi.
Any questions in what Professors Marcus and have said, but rather a reaffirmation of the importance of being able to recreate meaningful emotional experiences. And yes, in regard to the one question, many therapists use what's known as the house tree person test, in which patients draw houses and trees and persons and project onto those drawings many of the unconscious feelings and ideas that they have. And as such, they serve as meaningful guides towards the evaluation of the level at which they're functioning. Of course, we could get lost very rapidly in the whole issue of regression and regressiveness. And age regression or prenatal regressions are of interest. They become somewhat esoteric in a way because with every kind of regression experience, we always have a component of fantasy that comes in. And I think it is the wise therapist who will carefully differentiate between the fantasy evocation and the meaningful traumatic recollections. And there is much masking and much screening of material. But the process within which this takes place is what is most important. And the thing that I would like to really focus on, and I agree with all that has been said, and I don't view them as questions but as important contributions. But of course there is one problem, I think, in terms of therapy, which Professor Marcuson, to my right, has emphasized, but he hasn't emphasized it as strongly as he should. Regardless of strategy or technique, there is an individual characteristic of the therapist himself or herself. And in this case, we have a very powerful psychotherapist who is capable of drawing the patient into a very meaningful alliance. And you can feel the energy and the vitality. And that is something that one cannot usually devise by technique or strategy. That is something that is an inherent part of the character structure of a therapist as wise and as experienced as Professor Marcuson. But for the rest of us who do not have such characteristics, we have to rely upon strategies and techniques and instruments. And that's why we build libraries, you know. We can't remember everything that's ever been discovered or written down. So we build libraries and we put all that data in there so that when we need to know something, we go and get it. Other individuals retain everything and they can remember what happened in Messina 200 years ago, whereas I have trouble remembering what happened in Milano yesterday afternoon. But so much for that. But what I would like to really emphasize today simply is that we should not follow the beaten track in terms of hypnotherapy, and that we should be able to expect that if we want to create a better instrument, we ourselves are capable of doing that within the confines of the individual patient and the manner in which that patient reveals himself. So that in essence, there are two tracks that we have developed in terms of sensory hypnoanalysis. And I will very simply describe the two tracks. Although when you do anything simply, much is left to one's imagination, but I think you have good imaginations and experienced imaginations, so I think you'll fill in the details. One is having the patient focus on some aspect of their sensation, on some aspect of their bodily sensation, of their visceral sensation, some aspect of their awareness. And I'm using this in a fairly broad sense so that you have to be able, and I'll describe it with a few cases, to focus on what it is that they are presenting and what it is they want to share with you and what it is they want your help with in clarifying and in bringing into more consciousness, even though part of them is saying, I want this and I don't want this. And that double bind that they're creating is part of their neuroses. There will always be a part of the patient who says, help me, this is where I need help, and I expect a lot from you. And another part is saying, I'm not going to let you do it. No matter how hard you try, I'm going to stand in your way. It's as if there was a little demon inside that says no, and the other one says yes. And it is our job to intervene and to go through that very narrow passageway so that we can deal with both aspects, with both sides, with both ego components of the patient. Now, as I say, there are two tracks. One, we focus on these bodily awarenesses, these bodily sensations, and we ask the patient's help in the initial stages to tell us what it is that is dysfunctional about him or herself. Without their assistance in describing their dysfunction, we are at a loss to help them, because otherwise we're going to impose upon them what we think is their dysfunction, and what we as therapists think as the patient's dysfunction may not in reality do justice to the degree to which they are impaired. And therefore our diagnostic, our elucidating techniques, and some of the drawing devices which Professor Marcus made reference to are important when they're necessary. At other times, we can do this more easily and directly simply using ourselves. Now, the second track is really for patients who tomorrow I will go into much greater detail about, and that is alexithymic patients. Patients who lack the ability to describe their dysfunction, only to be, to use blunt terms, complainers. I don't feel well. I don't have any energy. I am depressed. I don't like my job. I get headaches. I have high blood pressure. I have all kinds of things. But when you ask them, well, what is it that bothers you? What are the feelings that you experience that are troublesome to you? I don't know. They don't find the words. They don't have them. We try. These patients, they cannot focus on meaningful bodily associations, bodily awarenesses, bodily sensations, the whole realm of the sensory order. These we use a process which Radzinsky, I say it slowly for the translators, Bernard Radzinsky of Montreal described as sensory hypnoplasty, which is a form of sensory hypnoanalysis. And Ben Radzinsky and I worked together for many years and shared many identical concepts and ideas. He was very creative in using plasticine, and he worked with many alexithymic patients. Plasticine, as you know, is clay, modeling clay. And what he would do would be to take modeling clay and add a little bit of oil to it, Vaseline, to make it more malleable, soft. And then would have the patient, under hypnosis, use his hands to feel the clay, and not to necessarily make anything, but just in a very non-directive way, in the same non-directive way that we will tell a patient, feel yourself, feel your body, feel your arms, tell me how your legs feel, what's in your heart. If one gets a little more philosophical, one might say, what's in your soul? to more articulate and sophisticated patients. Again, the criteria is something we have to examine more closely. With hypnoplasty, the same device, just use your fingers and keep modeling, keep molding, keep shaping. Don't let those fingers stop, ever. And what happens is you then say, and tell me everything you feel. Some of the associations which come out are very dramatic, and very often Dr. Roginski would add, with certain patients, certain components to the clay. For those who were anal in characteristics, he would add a brownish coloration which would look like feces. For those that had other aspects who were concerned with cleanliness, he would add a white component. In other words, he would match their characterological structure with coloration, so that this clay now had some lifelike association. It was not something that was dead and dormant. But in either case, the associations are the things that happen. Let me describe a brief verbatim transcript. And one of the advantages that we have in terms of some of the research I made reference to earlier this morning is that we have permission to record totally what goes on. This is an abstract of a session. This is a 42-year-old male, a professional person, who is compulsive and obsessive. He's very depressed, rigid, hypochondriacal. He's very stingy in his whole lifestyle, although he need not be so. He's hostile and dominating. He suffers from an irritable bowel syndrome and a number of other psychosomatic manifestations. Prior to the interview, which is reported here, taken from the segment, he had had several sessions in which stool-like associations, and in one case we did use plasticine with him, stool-like clay had shown for him marked revulsion, and he had hostility to it on each occasion. In other words, when he was given the clay and was told that it was and felt like a stool, he would get very angry and very upset. We used the same type of clay in order to break down his defenses. Now, under hypnosis, this is what the patient said. Do they have the door open back there? I can hear their translation. Well, they stopped, right? Maybe. You belong to me. And he said this with deep feeling. He's referring to the clay. You belong to me. No one is going to take you away from me again. I love you. And then he put the clay in his mouth and he began to sniff it. I dream about you. I hold you close. You're my only belonging. Everything else has a catch to it. Everything else has an involvement. You have to pay for it. This is free of charge, and I can have it any time. Free, free, free. He says this with much emphasis, not as calmly as I say it. With emphasis and feeling, great feeling. It is something to have for free and not to have to pay for it. That's what makes it so precious. Just to have something free and not to have to turn yourself inside out for it. You notice the language structure is interesting for a man with an irritable bowel syndrome. It's an exciting feeling to have something free. No one to supervise you or to ask you questions. A precious heritage, something of your own. You made it. It responds to you. It doesn't fight back. It doesn't make demands on you. I want to be free, and he shouted that. Love must be free. Love must not be attached with prohibitions and restrictions. It must be uninhibited, not interrupted. Don't interrupt me. He addresses himself here to the world, not to the therapist, because the therapist was saying nothing. It changes my pace, my time, my way. Every heart has a different beat. This can even be human flesh today. It could be divine. It's not dirty at all. It's a nice color, it's human. Nothing wrong with it. To touch, to smell, to bite, and he does all of these things. It's human divinity. if you can get there and touch it. They always spoil your love. They always spoil it. The world can't receive it. Your wife can't receive it. Even your doctor can't receive it. Even I can't. But it can. It's born free and can be loved. I raise you from the bowl. I raise you from the dead like Lazarus was raised from the dead. You are out of the toilet bowl, and you become my loved object and close to me. It is freedom as I have never known it. At this point, there's a tremendous amount of sighing, continuous, deep sighing. He goes on, you sigh because you find the depth in it and in me. You find the love that knows no bounds. It's enormous. It fills me. Then I have the strength, the veins to fill up, and I begin to be a father, a husband, a lover. I find my depth and I can use it. The sap goes to my very roots. This will teach me how to love. This opens the doors, many doors. So many doors were closed to me before. So many avenues were closed, countless ones. Love is powerful, it's vibrant, it's exciting. It twists me into contortions, almost too strong for me. I was dead from the feet up and from the hair down. I've been dead. Now I can walk, think, love, and fuck. I was dead before. I'm being born again, alive again. He now puts the clay all over his face. And all that it means to be alive again, like a spirit coming out of you, like a release from bondage. So much was there. I have been a slave. I have been a slave. Now the patient's removed from the hypnosis, and in a waking state, he goes on, I never felt such a spirit. It was almost too great for me. It shook my frame to its roots. Of course, when you release something so powerful, you get a reaction, something you harbored all your life. It's a release from prison, from bondage. It's like restoring the inner being, giving life back to me again. This is giving my soul back to me. It surpasses words at times. It defies description. So great. I can't really describe it. It's a life force. That's what it is. Libido. It's intoxicating. A wonderful feeling of Milan. Thank God for you. I can only say that it was supreme, like nothing I've never had before. Supreme, just marvelous. I still have the thrill inside of me. I quiver with excitement. It's greater than any sexual experience I've ever had, or any pill, or any experience I've ever had in my life. It's greater than any great praise I ever had, or any great accomplishment, because it comes from within. It's just marvelous. You once released part of that when you brought me back to the age of 4 in hypnotherapy previously. But this was my real self, not related to an incident. He's referring to the reliving simply of an incident. It's so great that I'm almost overwhelmed. I'm really dizzy. I'm almost afraid of it. You can't live in darkness all your life and then suddenly get the light of day. You wonder if you'll almost burst. It's like an explosion inside, tremendous force. Following this session, the patient showed basic general improvement in much of his behavior, in many of his attitudes, and he continued in therapy for some time and made great progress. But you see here, you get the patient's verbal, linguistic expression of what Professor Marcusson was personally projecting and describing as the force, the life force, the energy. But that life force and that energy has to become externalized. And the only way human beings can externalize it is through language. It is not enough to simply abreact an age regression and to live through a trauma. Yes, for desensitization, patients with post-traumatic stress disorders who have flashbacks and are hooked onto traumatic experiences, the kind of desensitization and abreaction that Sargent originally described and that we've used with veterans of the Vietnam War and from other war experiences is useful as a ventilating device. But I think you see here in the language of the patient, not the language of the therapist, not the ideas of the therapist, not the concepts of the therapist, but in the language of the patient, the experience, the feelings, the affects, the force, and the breaking through of things that he was terrified of before. A hypochondriacal man suffering from irritable bowel for years, depressed most of the time, speaking in limited monosyllabic terms, and being very hostile and very uncooperative. Now, and this is not the sum of the whole therapy, obviously, but with the use of this technique,